Hey guys, just before we get into it, I want to address something that a handful of you might have already thought when you saw this video. Wolf, don't you almost exclusively review games on PC, but now you're doing Spider-Man 2 on launch? What's up? Well, thanks to a very long story involving my parents absolutely ravaging an arcade in upstate New York on their anniversary, they might have given me their souvenir. So yeah, that's a whole thing, and from now on, I'm going to show you on screen what platform and control scheme I used for my reviews. Anyway, back on track. Spider-Man 2 is the 2023 sequel to the 2018 Spider-Man game created by Insomniac Games in partnership with Marvel for the PS5. It's an open-world action game with an emphasis on free-form movement through Marvel's version of New York City, just like the last game. Although this time, Miles Morales takes on a deuteragonist role with Peter, rather than being a secondary character. How well did Spider-Man 2 evolve the story and gameplay from the original? Let's get into it. Spider-Man 2 wastes absolutely zero time getting the player's attention, starting on a massive action set-piece fight with Sandman, which covers a massive section of the city. This is indicative of one of the biggest improvements over the first game. Spider-Man 2 has a greater respect for the player and their time. Most of the time, anyway. Sections that would otherwise take away from the gameplay that you would expect from a Spider-Man game have been drastically sped up or outright removed. For example, there were sections in the last game where you would have to play as MJ or Miles in a flashback, despite the fact that you, in real time, just showed up at the end of that flashback, so you already know how the events are going to play out. Now, MJ's sections are much faster, they allow the player more options, and they're in actual chronological order, so playing MJ's sections actually helps to drive the plot forward rather than stall it. In the same vein, sections that seem like something that would ordinarily just pad out the game for runtime are actually meaningful to the characters, such as a rhythm minigame section with Mysterio that reveals a lot about where Miles' true feelings about his current situation lie. Most importantly, from an overarching game design perspective, Spider-Man 2 cleans out and replaces the things from the previous game that didn't work while adding to the things that did. Deeper combat, more upgrade paths, a bigger map, an improved system for unlocking fast travel that doesn't constrain the map, faster travel in general, and something that I want to linger on for a brief moment, bigger and better boss fights. I don't want to spoil anything specifically, so I'm only going to show the one that you've been able to see in trailers with Lizard. This game has a fairly consistent difficulty curve, with the exception being in the bosses. The difficulty then has a tendency to spike for each real top-of-the-screen health bar boss that you encounter. And while that sounds like a bad thing, even those spikes tend to be consistent with one another relative to where you are in the game. Speaking relatively, each boss is roughly just as difficult as the last for the time that you fight them, as long as you're keeping up with your skills and upgrades. Moreover, bosses very often have multiple fights associated with them, essentially having multiple phases, but just a bit more disjointed and cinematic. And importantly, they're all difficult. There was never a point where any given boss felt anticlimactic or like a victory wasn't earned, and as for the one boss fight that was mostly a stomp, that's because it was supposed to be, and it did its job perfectly. I mentioned in the game design section the map is bigger in this game from the last, and that's where we'll start. The map is nearly twice as large by virtue of adding multiple new city boroughs outside of the island of Manhattan. By virtue of this, a problem that the devs would have to tackle is making traversal both faster and even more fluid than in the last game, a problem which they did attack by adding a new game mechanic that we'll explore later in the mechanical section. Adding the new boroughs also meant adding new additional variety to the city, such as the residential district of Astoria and the high school where Peter, MJ, and Harry all went to school together. Level design is going to be a shorter section this time because, generally speaking, everything that I said in the review of the last game is still true of this one. The world is a faithful recreation of Manhattan, now with the addition of Brooklyn, with additional areas and buildings that serve as either pieces of the Spider-Man comic lore, like the aforementioned high school, Oscorp, and the Raft, or the MCU lore, with buildings like Avengers Tower and the New York Sanctum Sanctorum. One of this game's greatest strengths, however, is how its world adapts to the events of the game, specifically in response to the presence of the game's villains and the progress that they make. Early on, huge chunks of the city are going to be covered in sand thanks to the huge fight with Sandman in the opening, but over time, the sand will be cleared out and the devastated areas will start to rebuild. Heck, one of Sandman's hands actually becomes a new local landmark in the meantime. Then, as Kraven begins his hunt on the superpowered denizens of New York City, hunter blinds will be set up throughout the city, obscuring their operations for their tracking drones. With time, you'll discover different buildings and plots of land that have been bought out to serve as staging areas and training sites, each of which you'll have to infiltrate to turn the tides on Kraven and make the hunter into the hunted. And none of those things even begin to approach what happens to the city thanks to the final villain shown off in the trailers, Venom, which I won't spoil the effects of for you here. Wow. Just wow. I'm speechless. I'm genuinely just... Do you want me to cover the stability section for this Spider-Man 2? No, I got... Okay, for this Spider-Man 2, very fun. No, I got this one. But from what I saw in the footage, isn't this game even worse than the last one? Yes, it is. Which is why I'm committed that this time, I'll do it myself. The reason I had you do the glitch and stability section for Spider-Man is because it was so bad it was funny. Spider-Man 2 has it so bad that it stopped being funny. Alright everybody, last Spider-Man review, you got a rant in the subjective section at the end, but this time, you're getting a treat early, because holy crap, Insomniac should be ashamed of themselves. This game was so broken on launch, it was pathetic. My first red flag really should have been the fact that this game completely froze during the intro segment, which is something that happened in both games, by the way. So, you know, strong start. Then things continued with the typical bug buffet. Sandman having zero collision despite the fact that he's a kaiju the size of multiple city blocks, getting softlocked as Miles. Again, another returning classic. Elements of cutscenes just flat out not being where they're supposed to be, like Peter being outside of Sandman's hand for some reason, or the magic wand and the note from Wong glitching in and out of Miles' hands when he's trying to read them. Peter's head retracting into his torso after a loving moment with his girlfriend. Encounters not being able to be completed because a single stray enemy got stuck somewhere with broken pathfinding, so I had to go find them for 20 minutes. I could go on and on and on. And you know what? I think I will, because these random peds sure went on and on through this staircase, and part of the roller coaster isn't even modeled. Part of the track is literally just missing. After the freezing and massive plethora of bugs, the game honestly didn't even seem finished. The thought crossed my mind. Spider-Man 2 seemed like it needed another 3 to 6 months in the oven for all of these kinks to really be worked out or even potentially addressed. But even so, I went on and on until there was something which physically prevented me from doing so. The frame drops in this game were unbearable. In the early to mid game, it would only sometimes stutter to a standstill, usually a few times before letting go and getting back to normal, most of the time. But in the late to end game, it wasn't just inconvenient. If you were moving beyond a brisk walk, it was unplayable. Seriously, I had to stop the game while mashing the pause button, hoping and praying that I would be allowed to save before the game caused my PS5 to explode. And it's worth noting, by the way, that on launch, Spider-Man 2 is only for PS5. This is supposed to be the optimized hardware, the best way that you could possibly play this game. If this were happening on a PC or Switch port, that would be a completely different story. But it's not. I barely managed to close down the game, hooked up my PS5 with the Ethernet from my PC, and then I checked for updates. And sure enough, there were updates available for Spider-Man 2. And with that, we get to the punchline of this big joke. If any of you have seen my Gaming Has a Ship of Theseus problem essay, you'll recall that I end it talking about a part 2. One where I expand on the back half of that problem, the fact that games nowadays are iterative. As I said before in that video, games becoming iteration-based pieces of software that can be patched rather than a set program on a disc or cartridge has changed the entire landscape of gaming as a medium. And what I'm about to tell you might as well serve as the thesis statement for that part 2 video. So for context, Spider-Man 2 isn't a massive game in terms of file size, but it's not all that small either. On a fresh install, it was around 50 gigabytes of data. Then the game broke, and I found this update. Would you like to guess the size of that update? Actually, sincerely, please guess. I want to see this on my creator dashboard on YouTube. I want to see your guesses in the comments. How big do you think this update was? Again, the full game, fresh off the disc, was 50 gigabytes. So what do you think the patch size was to fix it? 5 gig? 8? Something stupid like 15? Like something that's the size of another game? Like, please pause, give it your best shot, because I'm going to reveal it to you in 5, 4, 3, 36. 36 gigabytes. I didn't finish my count because they didn't finish their game. 36 gigabyte patch! The update for the game was 72% the size of everything that came on the disc. It wasn't like the game was unfinished. They sold you an unfinished product with a sticky note that was half the size of the entire game. No, absolutely not. Unacceptable. I don't give a single solitary iota about whether or not the game works now. The fact is that you launched and sold for money a broken, unfinished, and borderline unplayable game, which if I had not connected to the internet and wanted to play this single player game completely offline, could not have actually been finished. The only thing that made it worth anything was because you salvaged it. Spoilers, Insomniac, you got a 0 for this section. Want a better score? Sell us what we paid for. And if you got a problem with that, bite me. Hey there, thanks for listening to my rant. Subscribe if you support getting the game you paid for at launch. Don't listen to the voices mimicking dead loved ones. And of course, there are spoilers from this point forward. The story of Spider-Man 2 covers a ton of ground with both good and bad things, but mostly good things. This time around, I want to change up the format a bit. Normally, this is where I would give a summarized version of the story, but sincerely, the plot was so fast-paced and there are so many events that happen that I think this section would better serve you by breaking down more targeted individual points, rather than spending more than half of this video acting as a recap. Starting off with a good thing, Mary Jane is written much, much better than she was in the last game, and her relationship with Peter is handled significantly better. Their decisions make sense, emotional moments have reasons to matter, and the story doesn't wimp out on addressing their conflicts. Second, arguably a bad thing, the story of Spider-Man 2 is not a sequel to Spider-Man. It's a sequel to Spider-Man Miles Morales and a completionist run of Spider-Man with all of the DLC. This game's story expects the player to know everything that happened leading up to this point, meaning that if all you played was the full story of the first game and you didn't buy the DLCs or Miles Morales, then you're going to be very confused about some things. The game does have an intro sequence to try and alleviate this, told through the creative lens of Miles writing his college entrance essay, and it vaguely covers both the plots of the first game and Miles Morales, but it doesn't address any of the following. Why Yuri is no longer the police chief and is now instead an edgelord anti-heroine named Wraith, who Uncle Aaron, the Prowler, Genki, or Haley are and why you should care about them, who Finn Mason is and why Miles is upset about an event involving her, and the greater context surrounding why Norman Osborn is so obsessed with his son Harry and the lengths that he has gone to in order to save him. Essentially, if there is a side character in this game, there is a very good to fair chance that there's a lot of context surrounding that character that you're not going to know about unless you've played all of the previous material, which again, is both good and bad. It means that the story effectively gatekeeps people who just bought the sequel without having played the previous games out of understanding chunks of the story, but it also means that this story can go ahead with no holds barred. And it's this no holds barred story that we can have a villain like Kraven who pulls no punches. The game really isn't afraid to do what it takes to establish Kraven as a competent and terrifying villain, killing off Spider-Man's rogues gallery one by one in a demented hunt to finally find a creature that is equal to him on this earth. He wants nothing more than to finally meet his match in battle and die roaring gloriously while finally experiencing what it's like to become the prey. In the process, his great hunt causes massive problems for Peter and Miles, as he keeps manufacturing scenarios in which villains are as strong as possible to give him the best fight. There's no better example of this than with Dr. Connors, aka the Lizard, who was injected with a much stronger version of his original formula, and he transforms not just into his lizard form, but something much, much more monstrous. While Miles is tracking Lizard, the game also flexes its ability to shift in tone. As we follow Connors, we see the aftermath of his transformation, even being unable to contain himself in a room he specifically made for just such a contingency. It's implied that not only is this the strongest version of Lizard that we've ever seen, but that Spider-Man really won't be able to handle him alone, and even worse, Miles has never dealt with him before, so naturally given this context, this is a scary situation for Miles to be in. The tone of the game shifts from being lighthearted and action-oriented to horror with a much more methodical pace. You know deep down that Miles' spider sense should perk up if something were to actually go wrong, but it doesn't prevent this dark, run-down fish market from being any less unsettling. One by one, you need to look around and open doors to see if Connors has sequestered himself away to eat the fish, and one by one, nothing. Broken lights, broken fixtures, until there's only one door left. And of course, in order to open it this time, you're going to have to get close. So, if you're paying attention, you prepare yourself for the worst. The game is obviously setting you up for a jump scare, of course, and even if you might have noticed that, you're still not quite sure if... Okay, no, it's just his skin, everything's fine. Except it isn't. Because it's in this scene where the entire scenario has been crafted to condition you to be ready for a sudden confrontation with the monster, that the real monster appears. Sure, Connor's monster form is a problem. Kraven is an even bigger problem. He managed to flat out kill Peter when he confronted him, and MJ and Harry were powerless to do anything but watch. Well, aside from Harry using Venom to beat the ever-loving shiznit out of Kraven in the background for a few minutes, but then, in his moment of anguish, realizing that he just lost his best friend that he just managed to reconnect with, Harry gives his symbiote, the one keeping him alive, to Peter. Peter resurrects, stronger than ever before, but he's different now, and Miles knows it. Whatever that thing is that he's wearing, it's changing him, and if he doesn't act soon, there might not be any of Peter left to save. That reality is perfectly foreshadowed in this bait-and-switch scene, where the player is prepared to meet the villain, only to be given something far worse. The game does this kind of bait-and-switch again after Miles finally confronts Peter, and also casually uses the same move that Bakugo used to beat Midoriya in their first fight in My Hero Academia to beat Peter. They thought no one would notice, but I did. The game does this kind of bait and switch again after Miles finally helps Peter get the symbiote off of him and back to Oscorp. Peter tells Harry that the symbiote needs to be destroyed, and that he doesn't want to see Harry be consumed and destroyed the way that he was. Harry, on the other hand, is on death's door and seemingly out of options, so he snaps at Peter and breaks the containment unit, bonding with the symbiote once more, only this time he gives himself over to the alien completely. Consumed by his anger and a will to survive, Harry fully transforms into Venom. Peter picks himself up and puts on the mask, and the camera rotates into position for Spider-Man to face off against Venom in another emotionally climactic boss fight. We knew that Venom was going to be the villain of this game, and now it's the time. Except that's not what happens. Norman interrupts. Spider-Man gets absolutely ragdolled through multiple walls and a pipe, and you play as Venom. Last time, the game set you up to fight a villain and gave you something worse. This time, the game set you up to fight a villain and made you something worse. Something stronger. Something evil. Something unstoppable. I can never die. Thanks, I love it. Venom at this point is free to do as he pleases, and Harry is absolutely done with everything. And what follows is a full-blown massacre of Oscorp's security forces and the fight that Kraven always wanted. This is where that one-sided fight I mentioned in the game design section comes into play, and while I don't say it's boring by any means, I will say it is by far the easiest boss fight in the game. And it doesn't stop there, as immediately following your rampage that ends when you murder Kraven in cold blood, Venom leaps away and the camera pans back. Looking to where Venom leapt to, we can see that he jumped just behind a sign for a horror movie, symbolizing how the thrilling hunt has come to a close and how the nightmare is about to begin. Once again, as I said in the level design section, everything I said in the review for the previous game is still true of this one. The combat loop is effectively an optimized version of Batman Arkham or Assassin's Creed combat, except Spider Sense means that this is the only one of the three where having omniscient reactions makes any sense whatsoever. It's combo-oriented, much like a fighting game, where your button combos and the length of time that you hold inputs decides what moves you will do, etc., etc. Peter and Miles have different abilities and slightly different styles of gameplay, and the combat of the game is easily one of the best things about it. Either I can leave it at that, or I can double the length of this video by making the mechanics section just as long as the narrative section, which, considering crunch time, we're moving on. However, before we get to the visual and sound design, I want to address what I said in the level design segment about traversal. Spider-Man 2 adds a traversal mechanic that is new to the series, and feels ripped straight out of Just Cause 3 in the best way possible: the web wings. The web wings turn your Spider-Man suit into a wingsuit capable of gliding through the air at high speeds. This provides an additional option for maintaining your lateral momentum, even if you're in a position that wouldn't work for web swinging, such as being too high up or too close to a rooftop. Additionally, the game makes use of a trait that is unique to real cities: the fact that very often the infrastructure and contours of the cityscape will create natural wind tunnels. These air currents can be identified with your suit's HUD, and gliding into one will allow you to fly at max speed along it, providing the fastest method of getting from point A to point B. And one final thing worthy of note, the game is designed with mechanics that take advantage of the very specific controller used by the PS5. The DualSense controllers have actuated adaptive triggers, along with better haptic feedback than a standard rumble kit for most controllers. This means that L2 and R2 can actually give different amounts of resistance to the player that is trying to pull them back, depending on the circumstances. This is used when the player needs to apply a very specific amount of pressure to something in order to open it, get it to move, or pull it in a necessary way. The visual design of the game is used to great effect throughout, and the first thing I want to address is the UI design. The HUD in combat did its job wonderfully, and I'm going to throw myself under the bus to explain why. See, despite being a gamer with several dozens of thousands of hours and hundreds of games under my belt, I've never actually owned a PlayStation. Out of the 12 consoles and handhelds that I've owned, none of them have ever been from Sony. The only way that I've ever played any PlayStation game is on PC, or when I was like 10 years old on vacation with my family, when we could still rent PS2 games from Blockbuster. So let me just say, I struggled with the DualSense controllers. A lot. Swapping the location of the D-pad and the movement stick while also changing all of the names of the buttons was an absolute nightmare, especially with a game that has fast-paced combat, time-based parrying, and button-dependent QuickTime events. But the UI actually made everything work for me. When in combat, your abilities will be shown with these two wheels, representing your skills on the left and gadgets on the right. I was struggling immensely trying to remember which abilities were bound to L1 triangle versus R2 square. But then I realized the way that the UI was laid out. The left and right wheels are identified with L1 and R1, the shoulder buttons, and the wheels themselves are laid out in the same pattern as your face buttons. Once this clicked for me, I realized that I didn't have to remember the names of the different inputs. Instead of remembering L1 triangle, I just had to remember push left for the left wheel, and then push the top button on the face for the top option of the wheel. Although it is fairly basic in concept, the combat UI was actually executed so well that I, a player who hadn't touched a PlayStation-adjacent controller in well over a decade, was able to play the game competently. The game also uses visuals to indicate changes in the characters as the story progresses. Like how when Peter first gets the Venom suit, it takes on an appearance that's much more like his Spider-Man combat suit, but after it gets revealed as an alien, Venom stops trying to hide and brings out much more of Peter's negativity. The suit then becomes more vascular and organic, looking much more like the living organism that it is, rather than the uniform that Peter willed it to be. Peter and Miles are differentiated in a couple of different ways using visual and audio design. Their animations are substantially different for both combat and web swinging. Peter is clearly more refined and experienced. His traversal is more fluid and acrobatic, while his combat is more clearly martial arts oriented. With Miles, the traversal and combat are much more erratic and freeform, with his swinging taking inspiration from Into the Spider-Verse, with how he dives backwards off of rooftops and swings with a sense of chaotic freedom, and how his combat is much more brutal, with a combination of street fighting and breakdancing. Essentially, New York capoeira. The music that plays in the background of the two characters reflects the same thing. Peter has the same swooning orchestra that backed him in the last game, which again, is very refined and traditionally heroic. Meanwhile, Miles has that same orchestra, showing that a lot of him as Spider-Man comes from Peter as his mentor, but it's remixed with a hip-hop beat, showing his black heritage and his personal love for making his own music and marching to the beat of his own drum. You know, I like this game more than the last one, I think. It really did address most of my biggest grievances and then gave me more of what I wanted. Although I definitely regret not having the time to beat Miles Morales before this game came out. When Miles Morales came out years ago, I watched Jacksepticeye play it for a bit and I followed some of the buzz, but the general consensus was just, this is essentially a big expansion for Spider-Man. And granted, I own it. I did actually buy it, because the plan was to beat it and then upload the review of Miles Morales the same day that Spider-Man 2 came out, but things changed and I had to reprioritize a lot of things and projects in order to make the most of the end of this year, and then I got the PS5 and that changed everything. So now, go figure, what I only ever heard about as essentially a giant glorified DLC was actually the real Spider-Man 2, and Spider-Man 2 is now the official third installment of the series, so screw me, I guess. Even so, the main, most important plot points are derived from Spider-Man's story, not Miles Morales, specifically surrounding Martin Lee and Harry, so don't worry too much if you missed Miles Morales like I did. 8 out of 10 opinion score. I like it more than the last game, and when the game worked, I really liked it. Real quick, I'm gonna throw up a reminder about the ongoing spoiler warning because there are a couple things that I want to nerd out about here that didn't fit in super well elsewhere. This game has a ton of respect for the source material in the comics, and that's huge when it comes to adapting fiction from one medium to the next. The game transforms and changes things around a bit, but the references are all still there. My favorite one is probably Peter getting the anti-venom suit. I was super not ready for that, and I was completely taken by surprise. It made me so happy. Circumstantially, Peter gained the anti-venom symbiote the same way that Eddie Brock does in the comics. There were dormant remains from when Venom was bonded with them, and then when Mr. Negative used his powers on them, those remains became charged and inverted, creating the anti-venom symbiote that didn't have its own sentience, had the ability to heal instead of corrupt, and was no longer weak to sonic sounds. That's why Peter can still use sound in his fight with Venom, despite the fact that he is wearing the anti-venom symbiote suit. And beyond that, pulling out other obscure Venom characters. Venom transforming MJ into Scream was freaking great. And then because the symbiote's corruption brings out the worst in you, MJ suddenly started opening up and ripping into Peter about all of her insecurities and her anger and her dissatisfaction with her job, their relationship, and life in general. The writers literally used Scream to manufacture a boss fight, which essentially served as superhuman couples therapy. And that's amazing. This game has heart for Spider-Man fans, and I respect that a lot. So in general, I recommend the game, but not until probably next year after this game came out. Give it a couple more months for the game to get finished, I mean fully patched, and then use it to have fun during the January dry spell. But enough about what I think. Is the game actually good? You know, like I said, I really didn't expect to review this game. That's why I didn't review Miles Morales. It's because I got a PS5 and that gave me new opportunities, so I bought the new game instead. Or, 60% of it. But either way, I've been Lone Wolfie X. Subscribe if you're new, and I will see you, yes, you, next time.